The first thing the snowplow driver noticed was the color. Everything along that stretch of old Highway 40, just above the Emigrant Gap interchange where it folds into Interstate 80, was the same exhausted gray-white of a Sierra Nevada march. The dirty banks thrown up by the plows, the bare granite, the pines holding their loads of old snow. And then there was a single patch of pale blue, low against the base of a drift, where no blue had any reason to be. He thought in the half-second before he understood that someone had thrown out a coat. Then he saw the hand. She had been there long enough for the snow to take her in and give her back. The drift that hid her had been built by a storm and lowered by a thaw, and when it lowered far enough, it returned what it had been keeping. There was no vehicle. There were no tracks that the weather had not already erased. There was nothing on her, or near her, or in the half-frozen ground beneath her that carried a name. The county listed her, in the careful language of a case file, as an unidentified white female, age estimated between 28 and 38, found deceased at Emigrant Gap, Placer County, on a morning in early March of 1977. The cause of death would be ruled a homicide. The manner of her arrival in that high, cold, anonymous place would not be ruled anything at all. For 49 years she would be called Jane Doe. 49 years in which a generation of investigators would retire, in which the technology to read what her body still carried would be invented from nothing, in which a name waited somewhere in Michigan for the day the science finally caught up to the silence. This is the story of how a woman with no name and a snowbank on the spine of California was, in the early months of 2026, given back her name, and of the question that her name did not answer, the question that is still, as of this recording, unanswered. Not who she was, but how she came to be there, and at whose hands. Before we go any further into the snow, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and if you believe the unidentified dead deserve to have their names returned to them. Take a moment to subscribe. This is one of those cases where the silence is the whole story. To understand why a woman could lie nameless for 49 years, you have to understand the place that kept her. Emigrant Gap is not a town in any sense that the word usually means. It is a gap, a low saddle in the granite spine of the northern Sierra Nevada, at an elevation of roughly 5,200 feet, named for the wagon trains that came over it in the middle of the 19th century, lowering their oxen and their belongings down the far cliff, by rope, because there was no gentler way through. The mountains here do not soften. They are bare gray rock and black timber, and in winter they hold one of the heaviest snowpacks in the continental United States. The ridgelines above the gap routinely accumulate 15, 20, in heavy years more than 30 feet of snow over the course of a season. It is the kind of country that does not so much resist human presence as ignore it. Running through the gap is the road. In 1977, it was the old Highway 40 alignment giving way, mile by mile, to the new Interstate 80, the great transcontinental artery that carries traffic from the San Francisco Bay up through the foothill towns of Auburn and Colfax, over the Sierra Crest to Donner Summit, and down the eastern slope into Nevada and the desert beyond. It is one of the loneliest stretches of major interstate in the country. Between the last foothill exits and the summit, the road climbs for the better part of an hour through terrain where there is, for long stretches, nothing. No town, no gas station, no lit window, no reason to stop. In a blizzard, the chain control signs flash, and the traffic thins to almost nothing, and a vehicle pulled onto the shoulder is invisible inside of minutes, the snow filling the wheel wells, erasing the tracks, closing over everything like water closing over a stone. Stand in that pass on a March night in a storm, and the case explains itself before a single fact is spoken. The temperature falls through the 20s and into the teens after dark, and lower on the ridges above. The wind comes down off the crest and drives the snow sideways so that it does not fall so much as travel, filling every hollow and rounding every edge and laying a fresh sheet over anything left still for more than a few minutes. The visibility closes to the length of a vehicle's headlights, and then to less. There are no streetlights here, no lit windows, no town for the better part of an hour in either direction, only the dark timber rising on both sides of the road and the granite underneath the snow, and the occasional pair of headlights climbing the grate at speed, and then gone. Their drivers bent over the wheel, watching the white road and nothing beside it. A person could stand at the edge of that road in that storm and not be seen by a single passing vehicle. A person could be left there, and within the hour the snow would begin to take them, and within the night it would close over them entirely, and the plow coming through before dawn would throw its own bank over whatever remained, and in the morning there would be nothing to see but the same exhausted gray-white running off into the trees. This is the first reason she stayed nameless, and it is not a metaphor. The setting is the mechanism. A body left at the base of a plowed snowbank along that road in the dead of a Sierra winter is a body in the one environment on Earth most perfectly designed to take a person and keep them. The cold preserves and the snow conceals and the isolation guarantees that there is no one to see, no porch light, no neighbor, no passing pedestrian, only the trucks going through at speed, with their wipers laboring, their drivers watching the road, and nothing else. A woman could be placed there and not found for weeks. She could be found, as she was, and carry nothing because everything that might have named her, a purse, a vehicle, a companion, a set of tracks leading to or from, belonged to the open air of a mountain pass in March. And the mountain pass in March does not keep those things. It keeps the body, it gives back almost nothing else. The discovery itself was recorded, in keeping with the procedure of the time, as a sequence of plain observations, each noted without inference, each logged before any of them were allowed to become a conclusion. The remains were found at the base of a snowbank on the south side of the roadway, partially exposed where the drift had melted and slumped. She was lying on her side. The position of the body, the responding deputies noted, was consistent with having been placed rather than having fallen, though the file is careful, here as everywhere, to record that this was an observation and not a finding. She was clothed. The clothing was photographed and inventoried. There was no purse, no wallet, no identification, no jewelry that carried an engraving, no laundry mark, no monogram, nothing on her person that a name could be read from. Her hands carried no rings. There was no vehicle within sight of the recovery point, and the roadway in both directions had been plowed and replowed in the days before she was found, so that whatever tracks had once led to that spot were long gone under the blade and the new snow. The county medical examiner of the period conducted the post-mortem examination. The findings, as they would be summarized in the decades of paperwork that followed, were these. She was a white female. Her age was estimated, from the condition of her bones and teeth, at somewhere between 28 and 38 years. She had given birth at least once. The examination found the physical markers of prior childbirth, which is to say that somewhere there were children who belonged to this woman, though no one in that examination room could have said where, or how many, or whether they knew their mother was missing. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation. The manner of death was determined to be homicide. That was the entirety of what the science of 1977 could give her. A sex, an age range 10 years wide, the fact of motherhood with no children attached to it, a cause of death, and a homicide ruling that pointed at a person who had done this, a person about whom nothing whatsoever could be said, because the only one who could have named that person was the woman in the snow, and she could no longer speak. The examination proceeded, in the manner of its period, as a sequence of discrete and separately recorded steps, each one performed and logged before the next was begun. The remains were measured for stature. The hair was examined for length, color, and any treatment. The teeth were charted tooth by tooth, every filling and extraction and irregularity noted on a dental diagram, because the dental chart was, in 1977, the single most powerful identification instrument available, and the examiners knew it and treated it accordingly. The hands were examined for the small marks of a person's working life, calluses, scars, the wear that labor or its absence leaves, and for whatever ridge detail could still be lifted for fingerprinting. The clothing was removed, garment by garment, each one separately bagged and separately described. The skeletal markers of childbirth were documented. Samples of tissue and fluid were preserved to the standard the period allowed, sealed, and labeled and committed to the evidence locker, where, Though no one in that room could have known it, they would wait nearly half a century for a science that could read them in a way 1977 could not imagine. They photographed her, frame after frame, in the careful overlapping coverage of a forensic record. The body in position, the body from each side, the face, the hands, the clothing, every finding documented in an image that would have to serve future investigators who could never see the original. They took the dental impressions because in 1977, dental records were the single best hope of identifying an unknown body, the one biometric that survived and could be matched if, and only if, someone somewhere reported a person missing whose dentist chart could be pulled and compared. They preserved the fingerprints to the degree the condition of the body allowed, rolled and carded and filed for a comparison that would require a prior name to ever take place. They documented her physical description down to height and hair color, and the small particulars of her build, in the standardized fields of a missing person's record, so that she could be teletyped to other agencies as a set of attributes in search of a match. And then, having done everything that 1977 knew how to do, having measured, charted, impressed, printed, photographed, sampled, and inventoried, with a thoroughness that the era took as a point of professional pride, they were left with exactly what they had started with: a body and no name, and a homicide and no suspect, and a case that began almost immediately the long process of going cold. Every instrument they possessed had performed flawlessly. Every one of them had returned the same answer, which was no answer at all. It is worth pausing on what she carried, because what she carried, or rather what she did not, is the heart of why this case sat for half a century. In a homicide investigation, the body is only the beginning of the inventory. Around the body, there is normally a constellation of objects, each one a thread, a handbag with a receipt, a coat with a dry cleaning tag, a key on a ring stamped with a motel name, a bus ticket, a photograph, a name written on the inside of a watch band. Each thread pulled can lead an investigator backward through the last days of a person's life. The Emigrant Gap case had almost none of these threads. The investigators of 1977 were left to build an identity out of an absence. What they had was the clothing, and the clothing was cataloged with the patience that the period demanded, garment by garment, each described by fabric, color, construction size, and any marking, however small. A label, if it survived, was recorded. A size, if it could be read, was noted. The wear and the condition of each piece was documented, because a worn collar or a mended seam or a regional brand could, in principle, narrow a search. The clothing was the closest thing the case had to a possession, and it was studied accordingly, turned, examined, and set down again as a thing that should have spoken and did not. None of it carried a monogram. None of it carried a laundry mark that led anywhere. None of it carried the one small accident of stitching or stamping that has cracked open other cases. It described a woman dressed as women of her age were dressed, and it described nothing else. They had her physical description, recorded to the standards of a missing person's teletype: height, weight, hair color and length, eye color, the condition and any distinctive features of her teeth, the presence of the markers of childbirth. They had the dental impressions, sealed in the evidence locker. They had whatever fingerprints could be lifted, carded, and filed. They had the tissue and fluid samples, preserved for a future they could not name. And they had the location itself, the precise point along the roadway, the elevation, the condition of the snow, the state of the body, the absence of a vehicle, the absence of tracks, the absence of any companion. The file, in the manner of files of its era, recorded each absence as carefully as it recorded each presence, because in a case like this, the absences were the only evidence there was. No purse, no wallet, no identification card, no driver's license, no keys, and so no vehicle they belonged to, no jewelry that carried an engraving, no vehicle within sight, no usable tracks, no witness, no companion, no name. It was an inventory composed almost entirely of the missing, a list not of what she had with her, but of everything that should have been with her and was not. And so the central paradox of the Emigrant Gap Jane Doe was fixed in place on the first day. Here was a woman who had clearly been someone, A woman of an age to be working, married, raising children, a woman who had given birth, a woman whose disappearance from her own life should have left a hole that someone would notice and report. And here she was, on the spine of California, 1,400 miles of bad road from anywhere she might plausibly have come from, with not one object on her body to connect the woman in the snow to the hole she had left in the world. The two halves of her, the life and the death, lay in different states, and there was no science yet invented that could draw a line between them. To understand why she stayed nameless, you have to understand exactly how a body was given a name in 1977, because the methods of that year were not bad methods. They were simply the only methods, and every one of them required something the Emigrant Gap case did not have. The first method was the most obvious. Someone reports a person missing, the descriptions are compared, and a match is made. This is how the overwhelming majority of unidentified persons were and are identified, not by forensic wizardry, but by the simple intersection of a missing person report and an unidentified body in the same jurisdiction, around the same time, matching in the same particulars. The Emigrant Gap Jane Doe failed this method at the first step. There was, in Placer County and the surrounding Northern California counties, no open missing person report in early 1977 that matched a woman of her description. The hole she had left in the world was not a hole anyone within reach of that investigation had reported. And the reason for that, the investigators would have had no way of knowing, is that the hole was not in California at all. It was in Michigan, more than 2,000 miles away, in a different state with a different police agency and a different set of files that no California deputy in 1977 had any reason or any means to search. The second method was dental comparison. The impressions taken at autopsy could be compared against the dental records of any specific missing person a detective had reason to suspect. But dental comparison is not a search engine. It is a confirmation tool. It can tell you whether an unknown body is or is not a particular named person whose records you already hold in your hand. It cannot scan the dental records of the entire country and tell you who an unknown body is. To use the dental impressions, the investigators first needed a name to test them against, and a name was precisely what they did not have. The single best identification tool of the era was in this case a key with no lock to fit it. The third method was fingerprints, and it failed for a reason that says a great deal about the limits of the era. Fingerprint identification in 1977 depended on the unknown prints already existing in a file, a criminal record, a military record, a government employment record, and on a human examiner physically comparing them, card against card, one painstaking pair at a time. There was no national computerized fingerprint database in the modern sense. The systems that would eventually allow an automated search of millions of records against a single unknown print in a matter of minutes were still years from existing. A fingerprint comparison in 1977 was a human being at a desk with a magnifying glass and two cards, and it could only ever compare the unknown print against prints someone had a specific reason to pull. If the Emigrant Gap woman had never been fingerprinted in her life, and most women of her age and circumstance in 1977 never had been, having no arrest record, no military service, no government job that required it, then her prints, however perfectly the cold had preserved the ridges of her fingertips, matched against nothing, because there was nothing in any file to match them against. The instrument worked perfectly and pointed at empty space, and there was a fourth limitation, the most consequential of all, though it was less a method than the silent precondition that all the methods shared: the fragmentation of records across jurisdictions. In 1977, there was no single national system into which every missing person report and every unidentified body flowed and were automatically compared against one another. A missing person report was a local document held by the agency that took it, circulated by teletype to the degree that agency chose and other agencies bothered to read. An unidentified body was a local matter worked by the county that found it. For the report and the body to find each other, some human being had to think to look across the gap between two distant jurisdictions. And in the case of a body in California and a report in Michigan, 2,000 miles and a continent of intervening agencies apart, there was no reason for any human being to think to look. The systems that would eventually link the missing and the unidentified across the whole country into a single searchable record did not yet exist. The emigrant gap woman fell into the gap between two states' filing cabinets, and the gap was, for the technology of her era, effectively bottomless. That was the whole toolbox. Missing person comparison, which failed because the report was in another state. Dental comparison, which failed because there was no name to test. Fingerprint comparison, which failed because she was not on file. 3 doors, and behind every one of them, the same locked emptiness. The science of 1977 could describe her in exhaustive detail, and could not, with any of its tools, tell anyone who she was. Before a body becomes a homicide that no one can solve, the investigators must first rule out every gentler explanation, and the file moves through these alternatives one by one, disproving each before it permits itself the conclusion it has been circling from the beginning. The first hypothesis was exposure, and it was the most natural one because the place itself proposes it. The Sierra Nevada in winter kills people who are simply unlucky. Motorists who slide off the road in a storm and freeze before help arrives. Hikers caught out by weather. The occasional person who wanders from a stranded vehicle into a whiteout and is found in the spring when the snow gives them up. The mountains take several such lives in a hard season, and they take them in exactly this terrain, along exactly this road, and they preserve and conceal them in exactly the way the emigrant gap woman had been preserved and concealed. A woman dead at the base of a snowbank in March is on its face the most ordinary kind of mountain death there is, and that is the explanation the country itself seems to offer to anyone who finds her. But exposure was ruled out, and it was ruled out not by inference, but by the body. A person who dies of cold does not die with the specific injuries that were found at the throat. The physical findings of ligature strangulation are particular, and they are unmistakable, and they are not produced by weather, by a fall, by the slow lowering of the body's temperature in a storm. The cold could explain why she was preserved, why she was concealed, why she was not found for some unknown stretch of time, why the timeline of her death was lost. But the cold did not kill her. The cold was the accomplice, not the cause. Something with hands had killed her, deliberately and at close range, and then the cold had taken over the work of hiding what the hands had done. The second hypothesis was accident: a fall, a vehicle collision, an injury sustained, and then a death from exposure following it. This too was ruled out by the post-mortem findings. The injuries that kill in a fall or a collision are not the injuries that were found. The manner of her death was not consistent with any accident the terrain could have produced. She had not slipped. She had not been struck by a passing car and left. The mechanism of her death was deliberate, and deliberate in a way that requires another person in close physical proximity applying sustained force. The third hypothesis, and the one the absence of any identification kept alive far longer than it should have, was that she was a transient, a drifter, someone with no fixed address and no one to miss her, who had come to that high country by some hard road of her own and met a bad end there. This is the explanation that a nameless body in a remote place quietly invites, and it is the explanation that does the most damage, because it lowers the stakes. It tells an overworked agency that perhaps no one is waiting, that perhaps there is no family report to find because there is no family. But this hypothesis was contradicted by her own body. She had given birth. She had borne at least one child. Whatever road had brought her to Emigrant Gap, she had not arrived there from nowhere. She had arrived from a life that had contained, at minimum, the bearing of children. And children, in the ordinary run of the world, mean a family, mean a community, mean people who would notice an absence. The body itself argued against the comfortable assumption that no one was looking. Someone, the markers of childbirth insisted, had once depended on this woman. The fact that no report had reached California did not mean no one was searching. It meant only that the search and the body were in different worlds. With exposure ruled out, accident ruled out, and the comforting story of the unmissed drifter contradicted by her own remains, the funnel closed on its single remaining conclusion. This was a homicide. This was a woman who had been killed by another person and left in a place chosen, whether by design or by chance, for its near-perfect capacity to make her disappear. And the file, having reached that conclusion honestly by elimination rather than by hunch, now confronted the problem it could not solve. It had a murder, it had no victim's name, and therefore no thread of her life to pull, and therefore no way to begin asking the only question that could ever lead to her killer, who, in the last weeks of her life, had been close enough to her to do this. Investigators returned to the recovery site and worked it for what it could give, which in that terrain and that season was not much, and the working of it is a study in how a place can refuse to testify. The roadway had been plowed. This single fact, recorded plainly in the file, erased an entire category of evidence before the investigators ever arrived. Tracks, the tracks of a vehicle pulling onto the shoulder, the tracks of a person walking from that vehicle to the snowbank and back, the tracks that in any other setting might have told the story of how she came to be there, and in whose company. Those tracks, if they had ever existed, had been ground away by the plow blade and buried under the snow it threw. The investigators noted the absence of tracks not as a failure but as a finding, in the disciplined manner of the period. The surface had been disturbed by mechanical snow removal prior to discovery, and no usable impressions remained. Translated out of the case file register, that sentence means the road itself had swallowed the most important evidence in the case, and had done so days before anyone knew there was a case at all. There was no vehicle. A woman does not arrive at 5,200 feet in the Sierra Nevada in March on foot from any meaningful distance. She arrives in a car or in someone else's car, and the car is a thread, a registration, a description, a license plate, a thing that can be traced. The Emigrant Gap scene had no car. Whatever vehicle had brought her to that place had left it, which is itself a fact that points away from accident and toward design. A person who dies by misadventure tends to be found near their vehicle, and a person whose body is found with no vehicle near it has, in the ordinary logic of such things, been brought there by someone who then drove away. But the absence of the car, like the absence of the tracks, gave the investigators nothing to pursue. It told them what had probably happened in the broadest outline. It told them nothing they could put on a teletype. The investigators worked outward from the body in the disciplined widening circles the period prescribed, examining first the immediate ground, then the shoulder, then the bank itself, then the roadway, recording at each stage what was present, and, more often, what was not. The immediate ground beneath and around the remains was examined for disturbance, for blood, for any object that might have fallen or been dropped, for any sign of a struggle having taken place at that spot. The shoulder was examined for the impressions of tires, for the scuffs of feet, for the drag marks that a body moved rather than carried would leave. The bank was examined for the depressions and refreezings that the building and melting of snow over a body produces. And the roadway in both directions was examined for anything that connected the spot to a vehicle that had stopped there. From all of it, the same finding emerged, recorded without inference and per procedure. The surface had been mechanically cleared before discovery, and no usable impressions, tracks, or trace remained. The scene had been worked thoroughly, and the scene had yielded, in the language of physical evidence, nothing. And there was the body's own position, and the small, grim physics of it. She was found at the base of the snowbank, on the side of the road, in a posture the deputies recorded as consistent with placement rather than with a fall or a collapse. Though here, as everywhere, the file is careful to log this as an observation and not a conclusion. The snow above and around her had built up and melted down in the natural cycle of a Sierra winter, which means that whenever she had been left there, she had been covered by storm, by plow spray, by the slow accumulation of a heavy season, and had stayed covered until a thaw uncovered her. That single fact dissolved the timeline. In an ordinary case, the condition of a body and the conditions around it allow an estimate of how long it has lain where it was found, and that estimate is often the hinge of the whole investigation, because it tells the detectives which window of hours to ask their questions about. But a body sealed in sub-freezing snow at high altitude is a body whose clock has been stopped. The cold preserves, preservation defeats estimation, and the window of when she might have been left there opened so wide as to be useless. The cold had done to the evidence of her arrival exactly what it had done to her body. It had sealed everything, held everything, and then released only the part that could not name a culprit. The scene could say, in its mute way, that she had been brought here and left here and hidden here by the season. It could not say when, it could not say by whom, or from where, or why this pass, on this road, in this state so far from the life her body said she must have led. Cases like this do not stay open in the way the public imagines, with a detective tacking photographs to a wall and brooding over them by lamplight. They stay open the way a wound stays open under a bandage, quietly, with the file pulled from the drawer at intervals, reviewed against the same dead ends, and returned to the drawer with the same notation. Nothing further to pursue at this time. The emigrant Gap, Jane Doe, was entered into the records as the years allowed and as new systems came online. Her description was held in the missing and unidentified files of the period. As state and then national clearinghouses for unidentified remains were created in the decades that followed, her case was among the many migrated into them. A physical description, an age range, a cause of death, a location, a date, and the standing, patient hope that someday a missing person report would cross the desk that matched the body in the snow. Each pass through the file produced the same result, because the file had the same problem it had always had. She could be compared only against people someone thought to compare her to, and no one within the reach of the investigation thought to compare her to a missing mother of two from Michigan, because no one in the investigation had any reason to be looking at Michigan at all. This is the texture of a long cold case, and it is worth being honest about it. It is not drama. It is a folder reviewed and refiled, a description re-entered into a newer database, a dental impression preserved in an evidence locker through changes of personnel and changes of administration, a set of remains held in the patient custody of a county that does not forget its dead, even when it cannot name them. Each review followed the same disciplined ritual and reached the same wall. The physical description was reread and confirmed against the standing files. The dental chart was confirmed to be still on hand, still legible, still ready for the comparison that never came, because there was never a name to test it against. The case was confirmed to be entered in whatever clearinghouse for the missing and unidentified was current at that point in the case's long life, so that an investigator anywhere in the country who searched for an unidentified white female found in California in early 1977 would find her. And each time the same notation closed the review, nothing further to pursue at this time. It was not negligence. It was the honest exhaustion of a method that had given everything it had on the first day and had nothing left to give on the second or the 2000th. For the better part of half a century, that was the life of the case. The investigators who had stood in the snow in 1977 grew old and retired. The plow drivers retired. The road was widened and realigned, and the old highway became a frontage to the interstate, and the traffic over the gap grew heavier with every passing decade. The same passing trucks laboring up the same grade through the same storms, none of their drivers knowing that somewhere in a county evidence locker, not far away, a woman waited to be named. The world that had produced her changed entirely around the unchanging fact of her. And through all of it, the woman with no name remained exactly what she had been on the first morning, a homicide victim, fully described and wholly anonymous, waiting in the records of two states that had no way of knowing they were both, separately, holding half of the same person. The half in California was a body without a life. The half in Michigan was a life without a body. Between them lay 2,000 miles and the one thread that could have joined them, which was her name, and which the snow had taken on the day she was left there. It is necessary now to leave the snow for a moment and speak of the life, because the life was real, and it had its own hole in it, 2,000 miles to the east, that no one in California could see. The woman in the snowbank was, the science of 2026 would eventually establish, Melinda Beardsley, known to the people who loved her by the name Pip. She was a mother of two from Michigan. And here the disciplined voice of the case file must take over from the storyteller, because almost everything a true account would want to say next is precisely what the verified record does not support. How a young mother from Michigan came to be at a snowbound mountain pass in Northern California, whether she traveled there willingly or was taken, whether she went alone or in company, whether she had ever in her life set foot in the Sierra Nevada before the day she died there, has never been explained, and it would be a betrayal of the case to pretend otherwise. The distance between her life and her death is not a detail to be smoothed over. It is the unanswered center of the whole case, and it remains unanswered as of this recording. What can be said, and said with care, is this. Somewhere in Michigan in the middle of the 1970s, a mother of two stopped being present in the lives that depended on her. Whatever report was made, whatever search was undertaken, whatever years of not knowing her family endured, those events unfolded in a different state, under a different agency, in a file that bore no relation that anyone could see to an unidentified homicide victim in Placer County, California. Two halves of one tragedy, sealed in separate drawers in separate states, with no thread between them, because the only thread that could have joined them was a name, and the name had been taken from the body the moment it was left in the snow, without a purse, without a wallet, without a single object that said who she was. The genius of where she was left, if a thing so cruel can be called genius, was that it severed the body from the life so completely that for 49 years no human being and no system of records could put them back together. For the long middle stretch of those 49 years, the case did not advance, and it is important to sit briefly in that stillness, because the stillness is the point. Each year, in the ordinary course of things, the file was current, listed, described, available to any investigator anywhere who might search the national databases for an unidentified white female found in California in 1977. Each year, the comparison came back empty, because identification by database comparison still depended on the same fragile coincidence it had always depended on, that the missing person record and the unidentified person record would describe the same person closely enough, in the same fields, that a human being or a matching algorithm would flag them as a possible pair. For reasons that have never been fully laid out in the public record, that coincidence did not occur for the better part of 50 years. Perhaps the descriptions in the two files did not align closely enough to trip a match. Perhaps the Michigan record and the California record lived in systems that did not in those decades speak to one another. Whatever the reason, the match that should have been the easy answer, a missing mother here, an unidentified mother there, never came, and the case settled into the long dormancy that swallows the great majority of unidentified remains cases in this country. There are, at any given time, tens of thousands of sets of unidentified human remains held in the offices of medical examiners and coroners across the United States. Tens of thousands of people who died and were found and were never given back their names. The Emigrant Gap Jane Doe was one of these, one entry in a vast, quiet ledger of the unclaimed, each entry a person who was someone, who had a face and a history, and very likely a family still living in the half-light of never knowing. That ledger is the true subject of this case, and we will return to it at the end. For now, it is enough to say that for nearly half a century, the woman from Michigan was simply a line in it, fully documented and entirely lost, waiting for a kind of science that did not yet exist to come and find the one thing that had been missing from the very first day. Her name. Everything changed because the question itself changed. For 49 years, the only way to identify her had been to compare her against a name that someone already suspected. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was a technology that did not need a name to begin with, a technology that could take the woman in the snow and, working only from what her own body still carried, walk outward across the branching map of human relatedness until it arrived at a family, and through that family, at her. That technology is forensic genetic genealogy, and to understand why it succeeded where half a century of conventional methods had failed, you have to understand precisely how it inverts the problem. The old methods all ran the same direction, from a suspected name, to a record, to a comparison, to a confirmation. They were tools for answering the question, Is this body that specific missing person? And they were useless when there was no specific missing person to ask about. Forensic genetic genealogy runs the other direction entirely. It begins with no name at all. It begins with the DNA recovered from the remains, and it asks not is this person so-and-so, but rather to whom is this person related? And it answers that question by reading the long shared stretches of genetic code that relatives, even distant ones, hold in common, comparing them against the DNA profiles that ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded to genealogy databases in search of their own cousins and ancestors. A second cousin, a third cousin, a match many branches removed, is enough to give a genealogist a foothold. From that foothold, the work becomes the patient construction of a family tree. Birth records, marriage records, census records, obituaries, built downward and outward from the distant matches, until the branches converge on a small set of people who could be the source of the unknown DNA, and finally on the one person who fits every constraint the body has imposed: the right sex, the right approximate age, a woman who gave birth, a woman who disappeared from a Michigan family in the right window of years and was never seen again. It is worth being precise about the science here, in the channel's own forensic register, because the precision is the point. The first requirement is DNA of sufficient quality and quantity to build a dense genetic profile, not the short, simple profiles used in the older criminal database systems, but a profile dense enough to measure shared ancestry across hundreds of thousands of markers. Remains that have spent 49 years in the custody of a county, exposed to a Sierra winter before recovery, do not surrender that kind of DNA easily, and the recovery of a usable profile from old, degraded, environmentally stressed remains is itself a specialized forensic feat, the kind of work performed by the laboratories that have made cold case identification their entire purpose. The second requirement is the genealogical labor itself, the comparison against the consumer databases, the identification of distant matches, the construction of the tree, the elimination of every branch that does not fit, until only one woman remains. Neither half is fast. Neither half is guaranteed. But together they form a method that, for the first time in the history of the case, did not require anyone to already suspect who she was. It required only her body and the freely given DNA of strangers who happened to share a fragment of ancestry with a mother from Michigan, and the months of meticulous work to draw the line between them. This kind of identification does not happen by accident, and it does not happen inside the ordinary machinery of a county sheriff's office. It happens because, in the years since the Emigrant Gap case went cold, an entire field has come into existence whose single mission is to give names back to the unidentified dead, and it is worth naming the institutions of that field, because they are real, and because their existence is the reason this story has an ending at all. There is the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization founded specifically to identify John and Jane Does through forensic genetic genealogy, taking on, case by case, the very oldest and coldest of the unidentified, the bodies that conventional identification gave up on decades ago, and applying the new method to them with the patience that the work demands. There is Othram, a laboratory built expressly to extract and sequence usable DNA from exactly the kind of compromised, degraded, decades-old remains that defeat ordinary testing, remains that have been burned, buried, submerged, or, as in this case, left for years in the open at high altitude before recovery. And there is the broader practice of forensic genetic genealogy itself, the discipline that joins the laboratory work to the records work, the sequencing to the census rolls, the genetic match to the obituary that finally puts a first name and a last name and a hometown to a profile that began as nothing but a pattern of markers in a degraded sample. These are not the agencies that worked the case in 1977. They could not have been. None of them existed, and the science they practice had not been imagined. They are the proof of the case Bible's oldest truth, that in a cold case of this age, the drama is not a chase, but a contrast. The limited tools of the year of the crime, which did everything they could and still failed, against the tools of the present, which could do what the past could not even conceive of attempting. The dental impression preserved in a Placer County evidence locker through half a century was the best 1977 could offer. and it was a key with no lock. The genetic profile drawn from the same remains in our own decade was a key that could carve its own lock, that needed no prior suspect, no prior name, nothing but the body and the willingness of strangers, and the long labor of the genealogist. The same woman, the same remains, two eras of science, separated by 49 years, and only the second one could speak her name. Because thoroughness is the whole register of this account, it is worth walking the identification through as a sequence, the way the older investigators walked through a search of a cabin. One step, then the next, each logged before the following. One is permitted to begin. The first step is the recovery of the sample, and it is harder than the public imagines, because a profile is only as good as the material it is read from, and the material in a case like this is the worst kind there is. The remains, held in custody since 1977, are examined for the tissue or bone most likely to retain readable DNA after decades of degradation. In cases this old, that is very often skeletal. The dense interior of certain bones, particularly the petrous portion of the temporal bone deep in the skull, which is among the densest bone in the human body and shelters genetic material long after the rest is broken down, or the roots of teeth, which seal genetic material away from the heat, moisture, bacteria, and time that destroy it everywhere else. The selection of the sample is itself a forensic judgment, made by people who do this and only this because the wrong sample wastes irreplaceable remains on a profile that will not build. The sample is taken with the contamination controls the modern field demands, controls that did not exist in 1977, and that the original handling of the remains never anticipated, because a profile built on contamination is worse than no profile at all. It is a false lead that can send a genealogical tree growing toward the wrong family entirely, toward a name that is not hers, toward an answer that would be a fresh cruelty rather than an end to one. The recovered material is then put through the extraction and sequencing process. And here the difference between the old criminal DNA systems and the new genealogical ones becomes decisive. And it is worth being exact about it, because the difference is the whole reason the case could be solved at all. The criminal DNA systems that came into use in the closing decades of the 20th century read a small handful of locations in the genome, a set of standardized markers chosen to be enough to tell one individual from another with great confidence. That is a powerful tool for matching a suspect to a crime scene when you already have a suspect to test. It is useless for measuring kinship across distant relatives because it simply does not read enough of the genome to detect the faint, scattered signal that distant cousins share. The new approach reads a dense field of markers, hundreds of thousands of them, spread across the whole genome, the same kind of dense profile that a consumer ancestry test produces. And only a dense profile of that kind can detect the long shared segments of DNA that betray a third or a fourth or a fifth cousin, many branches removed. Segments inherited intact from a common ancestor, several generations back. Where the old systems asked, is this the same person? The new system can ask, how is this person related to everyone in the database? And that change of question is the change that, applied to a body stripped of every other clue, finally had an answer. The second step is the comparison, and it depends on a resource that did not exist for almost the entire span of this case: the willingness of ordinary people to have their own DNA read and to make the results available. The dense profile is uploaded to the genealogy databases that permit law enforcement comparison, the ones whose users have specifically consented to exactly this use, because the ethics of the field rest on that consent, and the field has been careful to build itself on the databases where it is granted. The system then returns a list of the people in those databases who share segments of DNA with the unknown remains, ranked by how much they share, which is to say, by how closely they are related. A parent or a sibling would share a great deal, roughly half the genome. A first cousin shares less, a second cousin less again. A third cousin shares only a little, a few segments inherited from a common great-great-grandparent 2 or 3 generations back. In the cases that get solved, there is almost never a close relative sitting in the database waiting to be found. If there were, the case would likely have been solved long ago by ordinary means. What there is, instead, is a scattering of distant matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, strangers who have no idea that a fragment of the ancestry they share with an unidentified body in California is about to become the foothold from which a name is rebuilt. They uploaded their DNA to find their own roots, to fill in a family tree, to satisfy an ordinary human curiosity about where they came from. They could not have known that in doing so, they would help give a name back to a woman who had been waiting half a century for one. The third step is the genealogy, and it is by far the longest and the most demanding, because it is here that the cold mathematics of shared DNA must be turned into the warm and complicated facts of actual human families. From the distant matches, the genealogist works backward to the common ancestors those matches share, the great-great-grandparents from whom two seemingly unrelated strangers both descend, and from whom the shared DNA insists the unknown woman must also descend. Then, the genealogist works forward again, building the descending branches of the family tree downward, through the generations and outward across the marriages, assembling it from the public record, one document at a time: birth records, marriage records, death records, the decennial census enumerations that list households member by member across the decades, the city directories, the obituaries that quietly record who survived whom and where they had moved to and what their married names had become. The tree grows, and it grows in every direction at once, a vast branching structure of names and dates, most of which will turn out to have nothing to do with the woman in the snow. Then the pruning begins, and the pruning is the real work. Branches that cannot produce a person matching the known constraints of the body are cut away. The constraints are everything the 1977 examination established and everything the genealogy itself imposes: the right sex, the right approximate age within that 10-year window, a woman who had borne at least one child, a woman who descends from the right common ancestors at the right genetic distance to produce the pattern of matches observed. Above all, a woman who left her family at the right time and was never accounted for again, because the body in the snow belongs, by definition, to someone who vanished from a family and never came back. And a branch that ends in a woman who lived a long and documented life cannot be the branch that ends in the emigrant gap Jane Doe. Branch by branch, generation by generation, the genealogist closes the doors that cannot lead anywhere, exactly as the 1977 investigators closed the doors of exposure and accident, and the unmissed drifter, the same funnel of elimination, run not on the manner of death, but on the identity of the dead. The tree narrows, the candidates dwindle, and eventually, if the work is done well, and the records cooperate, and the matches are strong enough to carry the weight, the surviving branches converge on a single individual. A woman of the right sex and the right approximate age. A mother who left a Michigan family at the right moment in the right years and was never found. A candidate. A name that the body itself could not say, but that its DNA, read across the whole field of human relatedness, finally spelled out. The fourth and final step is confirmation, and it returns the case, in a sense, to where it began, to the same logic of direct comparison that 1977 possessed and could not use, now finally given something to compare. The genealogical identification, for all its rigor, produces only a hypothesis, a name supported by a family tree, consistent with every constraint the body imposed. A hypothesis is not yet an identification, and the field knows the difference and refuses to collapse it. Because a name proposed and a name proven are not the same thing, and the family on the other end deserves the proven one. So the hypothesis is tested by the oldest logic in the discipline, a direct DNA comparison against a known close relative of the named woman. A child, a sibling, a parent if one survives, whose own DNA can be compared against the remains, to confirm or to refute what the genealogy predicted. This is the step that 1977 had the logic for and nothing to apply it to. It is dental comparison and fingerprint comparison reborn in the language of DNA, the confirmation tool that was always available and always useless for want of a name to test. Now there was a name to test. The known relative provides a reference sample. The reference is compared against the profile from the remains. And when that comparison closes, when the body in the snow and the living relative in Michigan, are shown by their shared DNA to be exactly the relatives the family tree said they were, no more and no less, the hypothesis becomes an identification, carried not by the persuasiveness of a tree, but by the hard arithmetic of confirmed kinship. The key, at last, has found its lock. And the woman who had been the Emigrant Gap Jane Doe since the first morning of March 1977 becomes, in the records of two states that had each held half of her for 49 years, Melinda Beardsley. Pip, a mother of two from Michigan. It is easy, in the procedural telling, to let the name arrive as a result, a successful conclusion to a technical process, a case moved from the open column to the identified column. It is harder and more honest to sit with what the name actually means, because the meaning is the reason the work was worth doing at all. For 49 years there was a family in Michigan that knew the shape of an absence, but not the end of it. A mother had gone and stayed gone through every ordinary marker of the years she should have been present for, and somewhere in that family there were, by the evidence of her own body at least, two children who grew up and grew old inside a question that had no answer. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for those whose loved ones do not die so much as cease, who are denied even the small finality of a body to bury, a grave to visit, a date to mark on a calendar each year. That grief has a name in the literature of these cases: ambiguous loss, the loss that cannot complete itself because it cannot be confirmed. It is, by the accounts of those who have studied it, among the hardest forms of grief a human being can carry, precisely because it never resolves into mourning, because the door is never closed, the hope never fully extinguished, the question never permitted to become an answer. A death can be grieved, an absence can only be endured year after year with no place to set the grief down. For half a century, the family of Melinda Beardsley lived inside that endurance. Through every birthday she was not present for, and every ordinary milestone she did not return for, holding a question that the science of their lifetime could not answer until, at the very end of those 50 years, it suddenly could. And, for 49 years, on the other side of the country, there was a woman in a county's careful custody who was, in every way the records could measure, no one, a description without an identity, a homicide without a victim's name, a set of remains preserved and protected by people who never knew whom they were protecting. The identification did not bring her back. Nothing brings them back. But it did the one thing that was still possible to do for her. It joined the two halves that had been severed in the snow. It took the absence in Michigan and the body in California and proved, with the freely shared DNA of strangers and the patient labor of the modern forensic field, that they were one person. It gave the family the terrible necessary gift of an ending. And it gave the woman herself the only thing that the place she was left in had truly taken from her. Not her life, which was taken by hands the science still cannot name, but her name, which was taken by the snow and the silence and the 2,000 miles between where she lived and where she died. This is what forensic genetic genealogy is for. Beneath all the procedure, it is not, in cases like this, a tool for catching a killer, because in this case it has not caught one, and may never. It is a tool for ending a particular cruelty, the cruelty of namelessness, the cruelty of a person reduced to a line in a ledger of the unclaimed. Melinda Beardsley is no longer a line in that ledger. That is not everything, but after 49 years, it is not nothing, and it is the thing the case can honestly say it achieved. And here the account must turn, deliberately and without flinching, to what the identification did not do, because to let the restored name stand in for a solved case would be to tell a lie, and this is not that kind of story. Knowing who she was does not tell us who killed her. The homicide ruling of 1977 still stands, as open as it was on the first morning. A woman was strangled and left in a snowbank by a person about whom, even now, with her name restored, almost nothing can be said. Identification, in a cold homicide, is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of one. In the ordinary case, a victim's name is the first thread. It gives investigators a life to reconstruct, a circle of relationships to examine, a last known set of movements to trace, And somewhere in that circle, in the great majority of homicides, is the person who did the killing. But the Emigrant Gap case is not ordinary, because the geography that made her nameless also severed her life from her death so completely that even with the name, the line between the two remains a blank. How did a mother of two from Michigan come to be at a high mountain pass in Northern California in the dead of winter in 1977? The honest answer is that it has never been explained. Whether she traveled there of her own accord and met her killer at the end of the journey, or whether she was taken from Michigan and brought across the country to be left where she would not be found, is not known. Whether the person who killed her was someone from her Michigan life, or someone she encountered on the road, or someone connected to that lonely stretch of the Sierra, has not been established. The vehicle that must have brought her there was never found. The tracks that might have told the story were plowed away before anyone knew to look for them. The objects that might have named the last people she was with were absent from the snow. The identification has given the case its victim. It has not given the case its answer. This is the part of the story that the format would normally resolve, and that this case will not let us resolve, and the integrity of the telling depends on holding that line. There is no arrest to narrate, there is no confession, no trial, no verdict delivered in a silent courtroom. There is a woman who has her name back, and a killing that is still, in the truest sense, open. A homicide whose perpetrator is unknown, in a case where the central mystery is not who the victim was, but how she crossed 2,000 miles to die in the snow, and at whose hands. That question is not closed. As of this recording, it remains exactly as open as it was on the morning the plow driver saw the color blue against the gray. Return now to the pass, because the setting that opened this story is also the reason its hardest question endures, and the place deserves to be understood not as a backdrop, but as the active force it has been from the beginning. Consider what the choice of Emigrant Gap accomplished, whether that choice was deliberate or merely the indifferent luck of a killer with a body to dispose of. It severed her from every form of identification at once. The cold that preserved her also concealed her, so that the timeline of her death, the single fact that might have let investigators ask who was where and when, was blurred into a wide and useless window. The plowed road erased the tracks that might have described her arrival. The isolation guaranteed no witness, no porch light, no neighbor, none of the ordinary human observation that solves the ordinary crime. The distance from her Michigan life meant that the missing person report and the body would sit in separate states' files for half a century without ever finding one another. Every property of that mountain pass that makes it beautiful, its remoteness, its silence, its great burden of snow, its position on a road that climbs for an hour through nothing, is simultaneously a property that makes it the near-perfect place to make a person vanish. The atmosphere of the Sierra Nevada in winter is not the scenery of this case. It is the mechanism of it. It is the means by which she was hidden, the reason she stayed nameless, and the standing obstacle that still, today, prevents the case from being closed. And the place keeps its secret still. The interstate runs over the gap exactly as it did in 1977, the trucks laboring up the grade in the storms, the chain control signs flashing, the snow filling the wheel wells of anything that pulls onto the shoulder. Whatever that road witnessed, on the day Melinda Beardsley was left there, it witnessed without recording, in the way that empty places witness everything and testify to nothing. The science of our own decade reached across 49 years and into a county's evidence locker and pulled her name back out of the silence. But the science of our own decade cannot reach back into a March storm on a mountain pass and reconstruct the hands that put her there. Because the storm took those, and the plow took those, and the long isolation of that high, cold country took those, and they are gone in a way that even forensic genetic genealogy, which can name the dead, has no power to recover. It is worth holding the whole arc of the case in a single frame, because the contrast between its two eras is the closest thing this story has to a resolution, and it is a real one, even though the killer is not in it. Set the year 1977 beside the year 2026 and look at what each could do. In 1977, the investigators had a fully described body and 3 tools: missing person comparison, dental records, And every one of those tools failed, not through any fault of the people wielding them, but because each tool required a prior name, and the prior name was locked in a Michigan file no California investigator had reason to open. They did everything their era permitted. They photographed and measured and impressed and inventoried and preserved. They ruled out exposure, ruled out accident, ruled out the comfortable lie of the unmissed drifter. They reached the honest conclusion of homicide by elimination. And then they ran into the wall that their century could not climb, a method that could confirm an identity, but could not discover one, applied to a body that had been stripped of every clue to its identity by the place it was left. In 2026, the same remains met a method that did not need a prior name, that could begin with nothing but the body's own DNA and the freely shared genetic profiles of distant strangers, and could build, through the patient discipline of forensic genealogy and the laboratory recovery of usable DNA from decades degraded remains, a path from the unknown to the known. The DNA Doe Project and laboratories like Othram exist precisely to walk that path, and in this case they walked it to its end. The wall of 1977, identity can only be confirmed, never discovered, was not climbed. It was made obsolete. The whole problem was re-asked in a form that had an answer, and yet the side-by-side comparison must end honestly, because the two eras agree on the one thing that matters most. In 1977, the killer was unknown. In 2026, the killer is still unknown. The 49 years and the entire revolution in forensic science that they contained gave the case everything except the one thing the format usually promises. They gave it a victim. They could not give it a perpetrator. The most advanced identification science on Earth restored Melinda Beardsley's name, and the man or the woman who took her life remains exactly as anonymous now as she herself was for half a century. A person without a name, somewhere in the record of that march, whom no technology yet invented has been able to find. Now widen the frame all the way out, because the emigrant Gap Jane Doe is not a singular tragedy. She is one case drawn from an enormous and largely invisible population. And the true weight of her story is the weight of all the others it stands for. At any given moment in the United States, there are, by the most cited estimates, somewhere on the order of 40,000 sets of unidentified human remains held across the country's medical examiner and coroner offices. 40,000 people who died, were found, and were never given back their names. Each one is a description in a file. Each one is, almost certainly, a hole in some family somewhere, a mother or a father or a son or a daughter who simply stopped one day and was never confirmed dead, leaving behind that particular suspended grief that cannot finish itself. For most of the modern era, the overwhelming majority of these cases were, in practical terms, permanent, because the only tools available to resolve them required, as the Emigrant Gap case so perfectly demonstrates, a prior name to test against, and the prior name was exactly what was missing. Forensic genetic genealogy has begun, case by patient case, to change that. The same method that named Melinda Beardsley has, in the years since it entered forensic use, given names back to hundreds of the long unidentified. People who lay in evidence lockers and potter's fields for 10, 20, 40, in some cases more than 50 years, until a dense DNA profile and a distant cousin and a genealogist's labor finally drew the line back to who they were. Every one of those identifications is a family released from the ambiguous loss, a name restored to a person who had been reduced to a line in the ledger. The Emigrant Gap case is one of these. It is not, in the sweep of the work, exceptional. It is exemplary, a textbook demonstration of how the oldest and coldest of the nameless dead can now sometimes be named, and of the precise reason the old century could not do it and the new one can. But the ledger is still enormous. Tens of thousands of names are still missing from tens of thousands of bodies. For every Melinda Beardsley returned to her family, there are many still waiting in the careful custody of counties that have not forgotten them, but cannot yet name them, waiting for a DNA profile to be funded, for a genealogist to take the case, for a distant cousin to upload a test, for the patient line to be drawn at last from the unknown to the known. That ledger, and the people in it, and the families still suspended in the grief of not knowing, is the real subject beneath this single case. The snowbank on the spine of California is only where one of them lay. There is a lesson in the emigrant gap case, and it is not the lesson the format usually delivers, because the usual lesson is that persistence catches the guilty, and here the guilty has not been caught. The lesson this case delivers is quieter and, in its way, larger. It is that no one should remain nameless. For 49 years, a woman who had given birth, who had been loved, who had a family that searched for her in a state 2,000 miles from where she died, was held in the records of this country as nobody at all, not through cruelty, not through neglect, but through the simple limit of what the science of her century could do. The restoration of her name was not an act of catching anyone. It was an act of refusing to let the silence be permanent. It was the assertion, made real by laboratory work and genealogical labor and the freely shared DNA of strangers, that a person who has been reduced to an unidentified body is still a person, still owed the dignity of their own name, still connected to a family that deserves to know what became of them, and that the passage of half a century is not, anymore, a reason to give up. That is the civic meaning of a field like forensic genetic genealogy and of the organizations that practice it. They are not only an instrument of justice in the narrow sense of arrests and convictions. In cases like this one, where there is no arrest and may never be, they are an instrument of something more basic, the return of identity to the dead, and of certainty to the living who loved them. The emigrant gap case proves that. This is now possible even for the oldest and most hopeless of the nameless, and it asks, by its example, that the rest of the ledger not be forgotten, that the tens of thousands still waiting be funded, be taken up, be worked, until they too are returned to the names and the families that have been waiting, in some cases longer than the people working the cases have been alive. The plow driver saw the color blue against the gray, and a woman who had been someone's mother began the long passage from a body into a name, a passage that would take 49 years, an entire revolution in forensic science, the founding of laboratories and nonprofits that did not exist when she died, and the freely shared genetic code of strangers who would never know what their ordinary curiosity about their own ancestry made possible. In the early months of 2026, that passage completed. The emigrant gap Jane Doe became Melinda Beardsley. Pip, a mother of two from Michigan, returned at last to the family that had searched for her across the better part of a lifetime. She has her name now. What she does not have, what her family does not have, what the case file does not have, is an answer to the question her name only sharpened: how she traveled from a life in Michigan to a snowbank on the spine of California, and whose hands left her there. That question is still open. The vehicle was never found. The tracks were plowed away before anyone knew to look. The past keeps its silence as it has kept it for half a century. The trucks laboring up the grade in the storms, the snow filling in behind them. Somewhere in the record of a march nearly 50 years gone, there is a person who did this and was never named, and the same science that could find a victim 2,000 miles from her death has not, and perhaps cannot, find them. And so this case ends the way the truest of them do, not with a verdict, but with a name restored, and a question left open, a small light brought back, and a larger darkness still standing beyond it. It ends with a woman who is no longer nobody, and a ledger of tens of thousands who still are, and the quiet insistence that the work of returning names to the nameless dead is worth doing even when it cannot return everything we wish it could. Melinda Beardsley waited 49 years for her name. She should not have had to. Many are still waiting. That is the truth this snowbank kept, and the reason it was worth the long cold to dig it out. If you believe the unidentified dead deserve to have their names returned to them, and if you want to keep following cases recreated with this level of care and this commitment to the honest, unfinished truth, take a moment to subscribe so you do not miss the next case file. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight and whether you think the question this case left open will ever be answered. And we will see you in the next case, where we continue to give voices back to those whom time and silence tried to erase.